Hi, and welcome to the Institute for Liberal Values September Liberalism in Practice panel discussion. I'm really excited. This is kind of our back to school edition, and we have great guests today. We've got Arthur Chiarvelli. I said that right, Arthur, right? And Vanessa Ellis. Both of them are part of a movement called Grow Beyond Grades. And so they're going to be telling us a little bit today about the ungrading or non-grading movement and how they feel that that is a benefit to our students. We also have with us Elizabeth Spivak, who you may know as our co-host for The Dissidents and also an ILV fellow, and Mark Horowitz, who is a professor at Seton Hall University. And both of them have been talking a lot lately on various podcasts, of which we will link to in the show notes here, on the need for grading. And so we thought, let's get this conversation together, hear different viewpoints, come together in good faith. And what I know about everyone here on the panel is we all care about our kids greatly. And that's why we're here. And that's why we're having this discussion in the first place, even where there may be some disagreement. And then I am honored to be the host, Brandy Shupatinsky, also a ILV fellow, as well as a director of education at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. So Brandy, thank you so much for being our moderator on this panel. I know that education and this issue is of great importance to you as well. So with no further ado, I am going to silence myself. I will be helping with some of the moderation when we have questions. Oh, that reminds me, let me get back to some technical details. For those of you who are watching, who are part of Circle, you can put your questions in the little chat box. We will get to those after our initial introductions. And if you are watching and you're not a part of Circle, we invite you to be a part of Circle so that you can join in the conversation. However, after this live stream is over, we will be putting this on our ILV YouTube page for you to watch again. So Brandy, with that, thank you everyone, and over to you.
Thanks, Jen. And it's really great being here with you all. And I think for the sake of time and this fascinating conversation, I'd like to jump straight in. So Vanessa and Arthur, I want to know if you guys could take a couple of minutes and explain a little bit your position on Beyond the Grades.
All right. Well, I mean, back when I was a teacher, I prided myself on giving very detailed feedback to my students. I was an English teacher primarily, also math, technology, actually wore quite a few hats as a teacher. And when I got to teaching English language arts, which was really my major, I was really excited again, but I realized I had a young family and I was spending hour upon hour upon hour providing this feedback. And I think the thing that I noticed, and many teachers tell me that they noticed this, is that essentially when I would pass that back, students would just flip to the very back, find out what their grade was, and they would ignore all the feedback that I had given them. So here I am putting in these hours and hours and hours of work, not being a great father either in the meantime while I'm doing this over the weekend and at nights. And at a certain point, I just said to myself, why? You know, and as I looked into it more and more, I found that the very act of putting a grade or a score on something almost ensures that a student won't engage with the feedback. And there's been a lot of research on that topic. And so that just added to my dilemma. Why am I even doing this? Well, I'm doing it because my school requires me to give a grade at the end. But could I diminish the importance of those grades? And can I get into a nice feedback cycle with my students so that they're improving in response to my feedback? And then can we sit down at the end together and have some kind of process where we can come up with a grade? Because at the time I was in a position where I still needed to give grades. I'm an administrator now, but I am in a school that uses grades as well. And I don't think that there are many high schools or even K-12 schools that don't give grades. But can you do that in such a way so that you can really promote that growth in learning as you go, and then have a sit down where we can kind of allow students to be involved in that process as to what gets reported out? So that's kind of my journey in a nutshell. And then kind of wrote an article about that went a little bit viral, met a lot of really cool teachers, one of whom is Vanessa, who who I'm just in awe of as a teacher, is an incredible teacher, and asked her to come on board with Grow Beyond Grades. So I'm going to hand it off to Vanessa now.
Sure. Thank you, Arthur. So my story is very similar to Arthur's. I was a social studies teacher, middle grades, and there was this moment where I'm giving all of this feedback, spending hours and hours of my personal time, my planning time. Sometimes even when my students are learning and I'm just trying to like sneak in and hurry up and grade something instead of attending to my students in the moment like I should. And so I had the exact same question, Arthur. It was why? Who does this really benefit? Because the students aren't going to pay attention to the feedback. I'm going at a what is it called? Breakneck pace. Yeah, sorry. And I'm covering so much content from, all of the history domains, and I'm struggling to make sure that my students are learning the content. And so I just asked myself, why? This isn't serving the students. It's not a great use of my time. And so I said, there has to be an alternative. And I started grad school, and it was a trends and issues class, and we got to pick something that we wanted to study. So I picked alternative grading, and I started to do all this research, and I had to keep like a blog and all of this. And so I kind of put my amateur thoughts out there on the internet. And then Arthur connected with me. He saw some of my work and he was like, hey, would you like to write a piece for Beyond Grades? And I was like, I'm kind of a novice to this. I'm not really sure if I have a voice. But he really gave me the confidence and encouraged me to say, well, there are teachers out there just like you who are kind of exploring and trying to figure out where they fit in this kind of ungrading spectrum, this umbrella. So I wrote a piece, and it was for people like me. Like, I'm not exactly gradeless, but I'm trying to grade less. I'm trying to make sure that the focus is on learning. So it's been a really awesome journey, and it's led me to become part of the Grow Beyond Grades team. And not only do I get to connect with other educators through our little organization, but I'm able to do some work locally, like within my school and within my district, to kind of make that change. So it's been really awesome.
Thank you both. There's so much to discuss there, and we will get to it. But before we do, I want to ask same question for Elizabeth and Mark, but I guess kind of on the opposite side. What is inspiring you to take the position that you guys both implement with grading?
You should go first, Mark, because you've done some of the research.
Happy to do that. Yes, I am. Just a brief bio again. I'm a professor of sociology at Seton Hall University, pretty late to the game in exploring issues of higher education. My concern that immediately prompted a fairly ambitious survey that my colleagues and I published last year. There's a survey of faculty in the country on the issue of grade inflation. So I come at this worried, basically, about the eroding legitimacy of the college degree. We're in a situation, I was looking at some Pew data, it suggested only about 22% of the public now believe that a college degree is worth it, if it entails any loans at all. I know that doing some of the background research for my survey, I discovered that almost half of college grades now are A's. And it was about 15% or so in the 1960s. So there's been a dramatic increase in grades over the years, and yet this is happening right now at the same time where standardized test scores are actually dropping. This occurs in high school as well. We're witnessing increased grades while standardized scores are dropping. And if you put this in the sort of larger context of traditional, often conservative opposition to higher education, it's troubling to me. So I guess the fear I have, and this will prompt some discussion later perhaps, is the fear I have is that however well-intentioned, and I definitely think it is deeply well-intentioned, the ungrading movement is, that it ultimately will result, and I wasn't able to find data on this when I perused some of the literature, it will ultimately result in effectively higher grades as well, which will contribute to the eroding legitimacy of the degree. And there's other threads to it, but we'll get to that later.
So I am a professor of psychology. Sorry about my voice. In the New England area, Bridgewater State University, and I come to this more maybe like Arthur and Vanessa, experientially. One of my students one time came, in my stats class, came up and said, well, how can I pass your class if you're going to grade what I turn in? And this was a revelation for me. What do you mean, if I'm going to grade it? It did not occur to me that I should not grade statistics in a program that requires statistics, as a prerequisite. Another time, a colleague in education said to me, oh, I don't give anything other than A's and B's. I don't fail anybody or anything. That's just mean. And there's a state test for teachers, so that will weed them out. So sort of, letting them go along, as Mark said, sort of pay for their college degree or whatever, and believe maybe that they're qualified for something that they're not, assuming that there would be someplace, somewhere else along the line, someone would sort of catch up. And certainly I have used my own, I do research with students, certainly experiential learning. I've done portfolio learning in some of my classes. And I have not noticed that there's any real attention to that sort of the process that Arthur, you described, where students in your chapter in the ungrading book, where you feel that students really return to that material and energetically, enthusiastically, revisit, reflect, that kind of thing. I haven't noticed that kind of thing at the college level, and maybe it's because there's so much more pressure, other classes and that kind of thing. But the main problem I think that I'm having with this is that when I look back to my syllabi even 10 years ago, students now could not handle that material. That level of material that I was assigning even 10 years ago is simply beyond what many of our students are capable of now. And so many of them are coming at they're reading at the 5th grade level, and we're lucky if they're doing math at that level. So I am concerned that students maybe are getting used to not being, held accountable for their, their math assignments and their writing ability and that kind of thing.
Thank you. I think a really important question to ask and to consider right now, because since we're talking about grading and a little bit of discussion about testing, to ask each of you as educators, what do you consider the purpose of grading and testing to be? What's the purpose of assessments? And I mean, we can reverse order it. And Elizabeth, if you can.
I think, we really do need to be informing students, and maybe at younger ages, parents, about their progress, and, give them some feedback as to whether, how learning is going. Certainly not grades aren't certainly, the only measure of things, but they are a somewhat universally understood, however flawed they are somewhat universally understood. And that has value in my mind, in and of itself. So I also think that we should, although I agree that some sort of happenstance of our environment and our abilities impact our education, we still need to be judged on what we do with those things, what we do with those capabilities, what we do with that preparation. So, we really need to prepare students, for example, for things like, job interviews and, getting promotions, that there are going to be real life evaluations. I recently interviewed a student, was involved in interviewing people for a job. And I was so impressed because one of the people asked us, the people who were interviewing him, how will I know if I'm doing a good job. So he asked in his interview, how will you give me feedback? How will I know if I'm doing well enough? So not just, sort of qualitative kinds of feedback, but he seemed to want to know whether he would essentially be, graded, if you will. So I think that that students need to know whether they're doing excellent, whether they're doing good work, and I think it's hard to know if they aren't given grades.
Arthur, what about, like, from your position, what do you think the purpose of grading is, or assessments?
Well, I think for the main reason I wouldn't disagree with Elizabeth is that it's meant to communicate, to students and parents when we're talking about K-12. I do think that there was an aspect of scaling education, which became sort of a need as it became more and more universal and more people were going to school, that it's easier to do that with numbers rather than just narrating that, giving that sort of verbal feedback or written feedback, that it becomes difficult to do that at scale. So, I mean, I think there's also some other things that I agree with Elizabeth. I think that one of the if I may go into part of the reason why I think that they kind of fail on that count is that they, on a number of counts, one, not everything is measurable. And in fact, I think some of the most meaningful things that there are nearly impossible to measure. And so what you end up doing, and I definitely noticed this in English language arts, which is this rich, interconnected discipline, that you are narrowing it down to that thin sliver of measurables that there are in the English language arts. And I've done it before, believe me. I've been basically mandated to create a test for the classes that I teach. And I was also sort of mandated to make that multiple choice. I think that it would have been hard even if I hadn't just been limited to multiple choice. But I think what the thing you notice as you're developing that is that you're really eviscerating what writing is. You're really eviscerating what reading is. And I think the point that John Warner makes in his book, Why They Can't Write, is because they have been writing to this incredibly narrow picture of what writing actually is, and to this incredibly artificial audience of readers who don't really even exist in the real world, because no one reads a 5-paragraph essay in the real world. And yet that's what we're forced to teach. We're forced to teach that because it's standardizable and it's measurable. And so we can't open it up to the kind of growth and creativity and learning that can happen when we can engage in narrative feedback that is just by its very nature able to accommodate that richness. And so I really place some of the why can't they write anymore? Why can't they read anymore? Why can't they do this or that anymore? Because of the explosion of high stakes testing that happened at the beginning of this century. And that's why you are getting the kinds of students that you're getting at the higher education level.
Thank you for that. That kind of will lead us to the next question. But before we get to it, I want to give Mark and Vanessa an opportunity to address that question. Like, what do you feel the purpose of grading is? So, Mark, if you can.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I'm ultimately going to echo Elizabeth's point, and I'll sort of summarize her point, I hope fairly, by suggesting that there is a function to education and signaling competence and grit in the domain where a particular student and ultimately professional want to go in their careers. So let me stress, though, in saying that I do believe something else that I think will probably unify everybody in the panel. I believe that what's most important about education is educating and learning, right? We hope to cultivate student skills, not just in terms of the work world, but also in terms of wider civic sensibilities, how students could participate ultimately in democracy more robustly. So these are all very, very important things I think we all care about. But I just have to drive home this point. The idea that that's somehow contradicting the signaling function doesn't make sense to me. We live in a complex economy, for better or for worse. Maybe we can, that's a future conversation about some of the perils or problems in a market economy. But we live in one where we have millions and millions of students competing for positions in the economy, and we simply must signal to them where their skills are and if they, and where the areas they need to improve. And why is that important? Well, because if they're going to choose a career where the skill sets are lacking, they need to be aware that there could be consequences for that, right? So we signal to them, but we also signal to employers that this individual has the competence and has the grit to be able to succeed. So, Arthur's point that, I was grading and then the students only cared about the grade, I have to just say I'm deeply skeptical of that. I think in reality, if I stopped grading, the students would just be stressed out and they would want to know what their ultimate grade is going to be anyway at the end. And in the little bit of perusing in some of the blogs, I noticed some of the ungraders expressed that frustration, that a lot of students would ultimately be very driven anyway by the grade. In a recent study I looked at, I think the author was Hasenhoff and colleagues, she found that 37% of the students that took these ungraded classes actually felt more stress in them because they had this uncertainty. So I don't see any contradiction between applying a grade, obviously sensitively, but also opening class up for the whole richness, I think, that Arthur was alluding to earlier.
Okay, thank you. Vanessa?
I think a common misconception with an ungrading classroom is that it is a free-for-all, that students don't know what's happening. The teacher isn't doing anything. They're not grading anything. So how do they know what's going on? But in reality, when you take the stronghold of grades away, you have to replace it with another system that is going to communicate that learning to students. And I would argue that the grit and the tenacity and the accountability comes now with the student rather than the instructor. So before, the power is with the teacher, making sure that they teach the material, they collect the work, that they grade the work, and they distribute the grades. And it becomes this transactional relationship. You're working not to learn, not to, and as a matter of fact, students will try to take the path of least resistance because they just want to get the grade. It is no longer about the learning and the journey of learning. So in a very competent, ungrading classroom environment, you are going to create structures that support students in understanding clearly what they are learning and how they are going to show that they know that. And the power then is shifted to those students. And for me, being in a traditional public school, it takes time to make this adjustment. But what I see through that development is beautiful. I see the grit. I see I didn't get this right. So it's not just an F and we move on. It's, I didn't get this right. I'm going to revise. I'm going to retry. I'm going to learn. I'm going to use my resources, and I'm going to prove to my teacher that this is how I've grown, because now they have to communicate that through a portfolio, through a grading conference. It's much more rigorous because it's not just here's your work, here's your grade. It is the student, and the burden is put on them to prove that they have learned and are growing as a result.
Thank you. You guys bring up so many amazing points, and it has me thinking of a whole bunch of other questions, like follow-up questions, I think that'll really enrich the discussion. But one that I actually hear often is, are there any specific subjects or disciplines where grading is necessary? And a lot of times people do focus on things like mathematics or science, like where someone actually needs to know that 2 + 2 = 4. I argue, as somebody who is in the opposite side, in the social sciences and liberal arts, and as a social worker, that those fields are just as needing of competence, and so shouldn't be held at any less rigorous of a standard. But I guess my question that I'm going to throw out there for discussion and just jump in is, are there any specific instances that you see where assessment, where grading, where competence actually needs to be demonstrated in a standardized manner?
Are you hoping one of us jumps in, or?
I am. I'm a social worker, so I'm perfectly comfortable with silence.
I lean toward all academic fields should grade, and again, with the huge proviso that that's not my main motivator to be an educator. I'm just skeptical of some of the claims about the cascading harm that grades do, and that it demoralizes students and so on and so forth. I know it's not always easy. I'm certainly empathetic, and I think all of us are, to the struggles that students have. But I think the clearer the standards are and the more measurable they are, it's not going to be perfect, the fairer it's going to ultimately be perceived. And again, I'd strike the note regarding the declining legitimacy of our schooling system and our college degrees. We really do have to reckon with a lot of people in the public that are really worried about where we're going in higher ed. And that would add, I think, even more fuel to the argument that we should be moving toward objective metrics and not away from them.
I certainly include some pass-fail things, or all or nothing. I guess I would say all or nothing kinds of things. In some, not in every class, but in some of my classes, I certainly, in most of my classes, I will drop the lowest or several of the lowest, depending on, how much has gone on in the, how many assignments I have in the class. I've certainly done things where, a first draft, you just have to turn in the first draft in order to get feedback, and, again, sort of an all or nothing sort of thing. And I would also add to something that Brandy said. I would almost say that it's more important in things like philosophy and English to, engage in not just qualitative feedback, but quantitative feedback, because you have to look really deeply into those things for exactly the same reasons, Arthur, that you were suggesting, that it's too hard to, that it's difficult to grade, because, it's more obvious if a pilot or a surgeon hasn't learned what they need to learn in order to, sadly, it might be more costly too, but, because you have to spend so much time working with those kinds of, with texts, with poetry, I think was one of your examples, like ancient poetry, to really grasp them, that it might even be more important to give, a more quantitative kinds of feedback, as opposed to just, our qualitative assessment of whether or not someone has used the right arguments or something. They might, so I don't know. I might argue that it would be even more important. So one other thing I would say is that several of the research papers that I read found that students themselves, in response to some of what you said, actually wanted grades, even in areas where they weren't getting grades, and that, internships and that kind of thing, and that the field supervisors wanted to be able to grade the interns. Students, they had an actual a positive perception of grading in many of these studies that I had read.
I think I want to piggyback on that idea that I agree with you. If students come out of our system and they want grades, like that's the form of feedback that they're most comfortable with. And I have a good example of this because I worked a lot with Michigan State University's College of Education, and I had an experience, and it happened multiple times actually that I noticed this, but it happened in a pretty extreme example one time where we had this instrument that we were supposed to use with our student teachers. And it was basically Danielson's framework for teaching, if you're familiar with that. And it's just the whole universe of what it is to teach. And we were supposed to score them early in the year and later in the year. And when you look at some of these things, what does exceptional mean, or what is distinguished? What does that look like? You aren't going to be anywhere close to that. I'm not even all the way close to this description of distinguished when it comes to being a teacher. And yet so we sit down, and I tried to do a little bit of a student involved thing. So I'm sitting down with my intern, and we're kind of like working through this, and I'm just feeling this stress building, because this is early in the year, by the way. And I'm like, there's probably this 2, this 2.5 or whatever on the scale, on the 4-point scale. And the stress is building, and I'm just feeling this. And come to find out, she like kind of had a moment with this after the fact, and requested to be moved to someone else. And so, because we were having this fraught conversation about how am I going to grade this thing, and I think the practicality of this is really important. That yes, it would be great, maybe in a perfect world you could bring back that rigor that existed back when only 15% of people got grades. But with professors' precarity, with ratemyprofessors.com, there may be people not even signing up for your classes as a result of your not giving in to this trend. And I feel like there is a need to certify competence. And I'm seeing some of those comments Robin is making a little bit there in terms of licensing. And that we do need to make sure that the people we're sending out into the world are competent to do the things that we're certifying them for. But for me, that's a binary. That's a binary at every step of the way. And what I noticed when I went gradeless was I was much more likely to say, this is not good enough. Here it is. Go back. This is what you need to do. Bring it back when it's good enough. And good enough, in my mind, actually, probably, if I had to grade it, was at the lowest a C. That's so good enough in most graded classes is a 59.5, round up to the D minus, and then we send you on your way because you passed. And that's, to me, less rigor. That's less rigorous than what I did, which was certifying competence. And when someone got done with my class, it was, I certified it every single step of the way, or else I didn't give credit for it. And then we talked about that grade, which is meaningless and has no signal anyways. And that doesn't even depend on me. That's already happened. That Pandora's box is already open, and there's no getting it back. And so to me, that whole conversation of rigor is not really even necessarily the issue. And I do think that there's these areas. I think you could extend this to all areas where there's a certain number of skills that need to be certified, and we need to hold the line with that. Giving a student a D minus, or as happens so often in higher ed, curving the heck out of some exam in order to get enough people to pass, is not certifying people, is not credentialing people. And yet that's the way many people make it through. I mean, I flirted a little bit with engineering. There's a lot of people who are getting a B that was actually a D minus in those classes.
So are you suggesting that you actually failed, or in your in the book chapter that you gave more incompletes than you would have given D's? So where you taught, they allowed you to fail that many students.
I didn't fail them, though. Ultimately, I worked with them until that number was very low. But I would toggle. Actually, that's the way I did it when there was no grade in the grade book. I would occasionally, in cases where students had multiple assignments that they hadn't really demonstrated that level of proficiency on, where I would toggle the final grade to an incomplete. That's more accurate too, I think, in a lot of ways, because really it's not that in a lot of cases was they hadn't done it. I mean, and to have incomplete assignments actually factoring into a grade is giving you a grade that is actually even more meaningless than it would be otherwise, because it's not that they're doing poor, it's just that we have no evidence about how they're doing at all.
So are you resolving that in the summer during Christmas break, over spring? When are you resolving that? Because I don't see time for that in a college curriculum to, you know, to say, oh, you know, you have all, you can turn things in until December 12th. I have to turn grades in on December, you know, 15th or whatever, and you'll just get an incomplete. And then I have to work with those students over the next year. The university gives people a year to resolve an incomplete. So then I have, you know, more students that I have to grade and interact with over longer and longer periods of time.
I mean, I think we all work within whatever system we're in, and we need to find ways of negotiating what we do within that system. And I certainly had things that were hemming me in terms of what I was able to do, and I think that's going to always be the case. And I think, Vanessa, actually, you've written some interesting things about that, just in terms of you know, kind of negotiating that when you can't go completely gradeless, you know, how can you at least get some of the benefit and take some of the focus off grading? I don't know. That was me kind of handing the baton to you, if you want to discuss that a little bit. But I think it is like true to say that there are always going to be circumstances. And yeah, I mean, I cut it off after a certain point. And an I does become an F, you know, but I did feel that I got to a point where it was working a lot better than what it was when I was grading. So that was just my personal experience, but Vanessa knows more about this topic. Maybe.
So I actually want to respond to something that Mark said, and talking about like the workforce and what we're preparing our students and sending them out to. But we're living in a time now where we don't know what that future workforce looks like. And also, in terms of standardized tests and grades and things like that, like in my profession as an academic coach, I'm not put in a room, isolated, told I can't use my resources or anything else to try to figure something out. So I think when we say things like we're not preparing students for the real world, school is not the real world. And often those things that we put in place, those zero tolerance policies and other things like that, do not necessarily prepare them for the real world. In the real world, when you don't do something well, you have to do it again, or you have to problem solve, or you have to figure out a way to get it done. Oftentimes when we fail students or we don't give them a second chance to do work, that's giving them a cop-out. Oh, you don't know how to do this, or you can't do this, I guess you're not going to do it. But that's not even how the real world works. We have to make sure that if we're building grit and tenacity, you have to build that into your policies and your processes so that students can be resilient when faced with difficulty and failure and things of that nature.
I want to ask a question a little bit related to that to make sure that we're clear, because I may be misunderstanding. I know that there are cases in the real world where you actually don't have access to other resources. It really is that if you don't do something and do it on time and do it right, you will fail. And I know that there's times in the real world, just like you said, where you can kind of gather resources to get through something in a different way. And so I just wanted to ask everyone, like, is there an acknowledgement or acceptance that both of those exist, that it's not either or?
Yes.
Or... Okay.
Yeah, and I would just echo what you said, Brandy, by saying, again, I'm confused a bit, because the way I structure my classes, I have grades in all of them, but I'm deeply compassionate. Students can turn in second, third drafts. I just fundamentally don't see this contradiction. And I was reading the literature for the first time in preparation for this, and there was many claims. Arthur sort of hinted at this. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Arthur, but like, oh, well, what's objective anyway about grades or something like that? I see it as pretty objective. I mean, there's claims that I think there was one blog I read, and one of them said one teacher could give an A for a paper and the other could give an F. I mean, I've never seen that level of disagreement. I mean, it's never going to be perfect, but by and large, spending any time in higher education, I spent 30 years there, pretty much faculty kind of learn. I've been an advisor. I see the students' grades. If you have a C student, I've never encountered a C student in college who has a C because they have A's and F's. I mean, what they have is they have like C pluses and C minuses, and the grades tend to be pretty close. So one fear that I have, and maybe this is going on a different topic, Brandy, and we can just reel back to the others. One fear that I have is that deeply compassionate, progressive faculty, we bristle even at the idea that there's these inequalities in performance between students. I worry that equity is a huge part of this motivation. We see these inequalities and it makes us very sad and very concerned about it. And that the process of grading nudges consciously or otherwise toward essentially pushing people through, even if they don't meet the standard. I know you guys would probably, Vanessa and Arthur would disagree with that, but the question I had, and I'll end it with this, in the beginning, because I couldn't find any data on it, I would love to see courses that are ungraded, where you still have to grade in like 99% of institutions. Are those grades even higher than the grades in the graded courses on average? And I would suspect that they are, but of course I could be wrong.
So, I mean, one of the arguments that I've seen, and I'm sure a lot of people have made, is that the process of grading can really just rely on rote learning, memorization, not real deep learning. People memorize, kids, students memorize material to get an A, and then it's gone. There isn't really deep connection to the material. I'm just wondering what you think about that argument. If you agree with it, if you disagree, why not?
I think there's, I'm going to throw this out there. I think there's some value in rote learning. Look, if and this is a real story, Dr. Spivak, are you sure that 4 times 4 is 16? Because that's not what it says on not my calculator, my phone, because they're using their phones. If a student doesn't know their basic multiplication tables, how can they engage with more difficult material? How can they go to the next phase? So I do think, certainly, I could say, in psychology, I could say, well, people don't need to know the birth and death dates of, famous psychologists or whatever. Maybe. However, one might make an argument that would be useful to know if you are thinking about the progression of theories, right? And, I learned about so-and-so's theory of personality, and this other person came after that and expanded on that argument, replicated and extended that research. So I think that there's, for different reasons, in different, for different purposes, there's value in rote learning. Nobody argues against rote learning in sports, right? Where we just practice over and over, little skills over and over and over again. Why? Because we expect people then to be able to engage on the court, on the field better, because they have learned those little things by rote. They can just do them just like that.
I would agree with the idea that I'm a big fan of rote learning in a lot of ways. I like students to have quite a bit of knowledge before they engage with, deeper questions. So I don't disagree with that idea. I think when I start to question it is the, the metaphor that you bring up, Elizabeth, of practice, is that we don't put a score on the scoreboard during practice. And if we did, I would argue that the practice wouldn't be as good as it could be. So every single iteration of whatever drill you're running and you're putting a score up there is probably over time going to make people become disillusioned with the process and not get too excited about the upcoming game.
Maybe they don't get to play. Maybe they don't get to play in the game.
Well, I don't think they get to play, but I feel like there's some absurdity to that idea of just like, if we're using that metaphor of practice and preparation for a game, then I think we should, we can apply some of the same thinking to that we give lots and lots of real-time feedback. By the way, is nothing that the coaches need to take home and work until 1 o'clock in the morning doing. They're doing it on the field or on the court, and they're giving that information, and they have a sense of what that game is going to look like and they're conveying that information in a way that those students can understand, or those athletes can understand. I think that's very similar to what gradeless teachers do. Is they've seen that the constant putting the score up on the scoreboard is not helping matters. It's not getting kids engaged. And I think there's been a lot of research around that. If you've ever read the book Drive, that is one of the central kind of ideas there, is that those kinds of carrots and sticks, and he's talking more from a business standpoint. The business world is built around a lot of those extrinsic motivators, carrots and sticks. And the finding, kind of the central finding of that book is that does not work when we're talking about 21st century tasks that involve creativity, collaboration, flexibility, and adaptability. That actually, if you reward people or punish them, they actually do worse on those tasks. And so in terms of some game time, that's going to be having sometime later in the 21st century, we're actually equipping them badly for the kinds of things we need. Maybe we're equipping them really well for the 20th century, where, it's a matter of stacking boxes or assembly line work or whatever else. It actually works for that kind of thing. It does not work for the kind of 21st century tasks and dispositions that students need. So that's kind of taking that metaphor of what should practice look like versus what does the game look like.
Can I ask you to expand a little bit? What 21st century tasks are you alluding to, saying that it won't work for them?
Well, I just think that most jobs are not that kind of mechanistic job. That maybe dominated the 20th century. There was certainly plenty of jobs back then that required a lot of creativity, a lot of collaboration, a lot of outside the box thinking. Mm-hmm. But some of the studies that Daniel Pink cites in his book actually show people working, like doing a task like stacking boxes. You offer a reward or you threaten a punishment, they stack boxes really fast. But if you do something like, some sort of puzzle that you're going to have to figure out, and you offer a reward, they actually do worse on it. They do worse on that task. And his point is that actually 21st century has a lot more of those kinds of tasks where we need people who are able to think creatively and outside the box.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You go, Vanessa, please.
We're actually having this debate in Georgia. We adopted some new math standards, and these math standards, they went around like different people and talked to different employers and asked, well, what are you looking for in your future employees? And they named all of these things. And then they looked at their math standards and said, how are we getting students to do some of these 21st century skills? And so now that we are adopting these new standards and applying them, we're having the same debate at my school, which is, where is that rote practice? Where is that deliberate practice? Because a lot of it is through kind of like hooking them on a problem and engaging them and facilitating. And so it's just kind of interesting that how much content they need to know before they get into the critical thinking versus do you give them those opportunities to critically think and then introduce the content through which they learn it. So it's been an interesting debate here in our Georgia public schools with these standards.
Yeah, and I was gonna I have a disadvantage. I'm not an educational psychologist. I haven't formally studied student learning and motivation, so I will concede that for sure. But just in the last couple of weeks, just looking at the literature on it, I found a disjuncture. I found a lot of the ungrading advocates would make pretty declarative kind of slam dunk claims that, oh yeah, you give grades, students get demoralized and they don't learn as much and they're not concerned. And then when I looked at the literature on it, it was an absolute, to my mind, again, I'm not an expert by any stretch, I just started looking at it, it was just all over the place. You had completely contradictory findings. I found at least one meta-analysis that called the claim that extrinsic rewards undermine intrinsic motivation a myth. That was a meta-analysis. So I'm not saying it is a myth. I'm just pointing out it's clearly far from settled science here. And we can probably polarize in ways that are sort of weird. I don't think anybody like myself, I believe in the merits of grading for the signaling function of higher ed. It's not like every single thing I'm on top of them with a grade and shaming them or something like that. No, it's just they need to be aware that as they're progressing, they're writing clearly. It's hard for me to envision a 21st century skill that doesn't entail being able to read a book for an educated audience, analyze its core arguments, be able to coherently write about it. Maybe I'm pathetically old school, but I just think this capacity to read, analyze data, and then on the ideal level, going back to the signaling function, if a college degree must grade and ultimately provide some yardstick to let the student know that they could actually go to graduate school where you're going to have to do those higher order syntheses and things like that. So again, I guess I'm just in a little bit of a loop on this, confused about why there's a contradiction. I think I shared, frankly, Arthur's and Vanessa's values when it comes to deep commitment to learning, especially among the most vulnerable students. But it just strikes me that these things can be done in addition to traditional grading metrics.
It seems to be a little bit of a argument or debate over expertise and the importance of expertise in a subject and a discipline in a profession. And just kind of along those lines, then, what do you think the conversation about merit plays, if you believe it plays a role in the debate of traditional grading or ungrading or alternative grading?
Well, I think that one thing that merit does is convince all of us in the system, whether you're the student or a user of services, a driver over a bridge or whatever, that the system is not corrupt. So that those who are moving up the ladder, those in particular positions, are indeed qualified to be there. So the research that we were, reviewing in advance of this, several of the studies found that when merit-based systems were absent, or the participants didn't necessarily believe that the merit-based system would continue, that political, ideological, social, and economic status tended to be the alternative basis for people to judge upward mobility, and corruption was sort of assumed, that there would be, that those kinds of things would be used instead of merit, because how else would people get that position? So I do think that that merit is a vehicle for upward mobility for anyone.
And I think for a lot of progressive intellectuals, and I've been in progressive movements for decades, it's just I guess it saddens us deeply that we have inequality in the world. The political psychological literature suggests this, that people on the left end of the spectrum don't really like this idea of social and political inequality. We want more equality. We're also, people on the left liberal end, and this is an area, by the way, that I do teach in, it's political psychology, tend to be more empathetic toward vulnerable groups and the concerns of vulnerable groups. And that's all great, but the problem is it tempts us to want to make all manner of claims, like grades have no objectivity, everybody's ultimately capable if you just give them enough chances. That's not true. There's going to be a good number of people, myself included, who can never be an engineer. So I sympathize with you, Arthur, when you referred to your engineering interest. I know my strengths, and I know the areas where I'm weakest. And I worry that this agenda is deeply compassionately motivated, but in the end, it's probably not practical with the number of students that we're getting in. They're eliminating honors courses, so we're going to, in many places now, so we're going to get a whole mix of student abilities. I fear that that's going to drive to the lowest common denominator. Maybe I'm anticipating questions Brandy was going to raise later. So there's a whole bunch of different concerns here, and I think we have to separate clearly in our minds between conceiving of merit as simply a signal that someone can carry out a role in our society, and keep a wide gulf between that and their moral worth. Merit, to me, and I think to all of us, has no connection to anyone's moral worth. So I don't mean to elaborate so long and so many themes there.
I feel like we're on the same page with so many different things. I think the one that kind of popped out at me is why couldn't we communicate some of those messages about student competence to students without that outward signal? You know, why do those two things need to be married? It's why do they need to serve both those purposes? That could there be a part of the learning experience that is just me communicating to students? And I get that you brought up the question of scale, and there are some definite logistical questions there. But I think just in terms of communicating, what competence looks like and holding the line with that, I don't understand why that can't be done through communication, and not just using the 5 or 6 letters, but all of the letters to communicate that information. So that's one question that I have. I think the other thing is with merit. I think gradeless or ungrading really shouldn't be on the stand about this quite as much as the past systems that have allowed people to, for example, get to the highest office in the land through quote unquote merit. We know that there are many, 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 many other things that are factoring in to whether someone is able to advance in this society or not. That is the status quo. The status quo is that people have been able to navigate this system, and that this system has not produced the best and brightest and put them into the most important roles.
I think that kind of leads to an argument that the problems we've had is that we haven't actually based enough on merit. Because if unqualified people have been able to reach the highest positions or highest offices in the land, and they may not quite be qualified, or there are others that are more qualified, then maybe we need more merit.
I would agree, and I think that actually one of the things that I think Vanessa and I are kind of the point we're trying to make is that we feel that this is more rigorous than, for example, participating in the widespread grade inflation that's occurring just nationwide and seems to have no end in sight. And even the giving of a 50, like I said, the 59.5, and yep, you're ready for the next class in the sequence, and not having any way to communicate that to the next teacher or anyone else down the line. I mean, yeah, their great GPA is going to be pretty bad, so when they apply for a job, maybe that's going to hurt them. But I just don't think it's the most effective communication tool.
Just to follow up on Arthur's question earlier, I when I think of policy and anything morally relevant policy, I tend to think of like Kant's categorical imperative. Like, what if everybody did this as a measurement of whether something's right or wrong, right? And I just imagine, I don't know how many tens of thousands of students try to go to graduate school. So you imagine every university only having hundreds of like written pages for each student's progress reports and self-reflections, and having that, what would ultimately happen is companies would emerge, would translate all of that into some kind of measurable metric anyway. It's just utterly impractical in a massive economy with millions of people. Grades are not perfect, but they're the best metric we have. And they're also ones, I think, that would lend themselves to more fairness, less stress. And I'm, again, not a specialist in the literature, but I'm deeply skeptical of some of the slam dunk claims that I encountered among those in the ungrading movement, that these grades have all these cascading negative effects on student performance.
Unless we randomly assign people to, to graduate school, randomly assign people to, become one, profession or another. As Mark said, there's got to be some sorting. And from a psychological perspective, this is what we do all day in our lives, is we sort things: important, less important, right? When we're at the grocery, do I only have so much money? Do I want this or this? Do I like, am I more interested in this person or that person, this car or that car? We are sorting machines. And so the idea that we won't sort, is just, it seems ridiculous to me that we aren't going to sort. And so it's just a matter of how we're going to sort. And whether it's an A through an F or pass or fail, we have adjusted, and so have the students, they know, you know, I mean, when I look at a student now that has a 3.0, I'm not that impressed. I graduated with a 3.0 from my undergraduate, a 2.99 actually, and I got into graduate school. I don't know if that's possible now because everyone knows that a 2.99 is not a very good GPA anymore, right? So I think that we are adjusting to, and you said, Arthur, you said with no end in sight. There is, I mean, unless we go to some different, you know, category, there is an end in sight. Everyone gets an A, especially at the, you know, at the Ivy Leagues, right? And you know, if you try to, you know, I mean, you're right in that if you try to hold the line, you're the one, as the teacher, the professor, whatever, you're the bad guy. But we're still sorting, and they're going to figure out a way to do it. It's you know, no matter what the process is, we're going to figure it out. We're not going to just throw the papers up in the air and decide who goes to medical school.
Right.
I know I've been talking a bit, but just one last comment. I'll be quiet for a while. In the survey that my colleagues and I carried out last year, or published last year, we made the case that there are these institutional and cultural forces that are converging to exacerbate grade inflation. And they incentivize everyone along the way. Arthur alluded to that earlier. You can be punished as a professor if you're going to be too rigorous in your grading and you know get low grades, right? So the weird part about this move, though, with the ungrading, it's like we have all these reasons on the ground that are problematic and perverting our incentives. So then the solution is get rid of the grades. It's like, to me, it's almost like we have an obesity problem in our society. So the solution, let's get rid of the scales. It just doesn't make sense to me. We have to get at the root cause of the reason we have these performance challenges among students and why our institutions are set up in such a way for us to push them through. And that's how it works. I haven't been an administrator at the high school level, but I've talked to a lot of them, and there's all this pressure on them to push students through. Nobody's going to get an F. I have friends that are high school teachers that were told no Fs. Anybody shows up, they get a C. That's probably an extreme case, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Not even zeros. No zeros for assignments, no nothing. You have to give them a 50%, like you said, even if they don't turn things in.
And I think part of that is a ham-handed solution in that the 100-point scale was set up in a mathematically disproportionate way. So that you have 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 59%, or 60%. So that was set up at some point by I don't know whom, but it is just, it should be 80 to 100 is an A, 60 to 79 is a B, so on and so forth. Like the 4-point scale. 4-point scale is actually set up mathematically proportionally. So I think that is the 50% thing. Oh my gosh, that just created such a firestorm. It's like feeds into the whole culture war of you know, like we're turning all these kids into wimps. But I think really what was happening there is we're making the best of a bad system, you know, where the 100-point scale was actually divided up wrongly in the first place.
I think that this discussion, the debate around grades or grading or ungrading, sounds a little bit like we're arguing over whether we're going to use the metric system, like whether we're going to use centimeters or inches, because regardless, there's a measure. And I think that coming to the conclusion, kind of shaky conclusion a little bit from where I'm sitting, it's just a question over which measure we're going to use. There's still a line of competence that needs to be communicated. And I think my question is then, what's the best way to communicate that? Not just what's the most effective way to spare someone's feelings, but what's the actual best way to communicate whether somebody can actually compute, can actually formulate a well thought out critique of something that they've read. What's the best measure? Are we going to use centimeters or inches?
Well, that leads me, I'm going to jump in here. I want to get some of the audience questions, and to the audience, remember, you can type in your questions there and we'll get to them. But one of the questions now is actually to you, Mark. So Vanessa and Arthur have suggested that addressing grade inflation is through this non-grading movement in some way, shape, or form. You haven't given a solution yet to grade inflation. What would that look like? What are some of the solutions using metrics to address grade inflation?
Yeah, it's a great question. The position we took in our paper that we published last year, by the way, it's called underserved students or undeserved grades. The position we took there is a quixotic one. It's completely unrealistic, but if someone doesn't talk about it, it's never going to happen, right? So we actually argue for a return. This is a structural solution to grade inflation, to a return to public financing, because the situation of higher education, and the reason for that is faculty face just this daunting situation where they know that if they fail a student, they're going to be saddling them with massive debt. They also know that the student is ultimately just going to go find some other more lax teacher anyway and get around it if they have to. They're ultimately going to graduate and they're just going to be saddled with more debt. So what a socialized system would entail would take that pressure off of us. We know, yes, it will hurt their feelings to be told. I remember I was in 4th grade. I wanted to be in choir and I didn't make it. And the fact I remember this moment says that it hit me, but I just think part of growth and wisdom is like, my dream of being a singer was gone that day, I adjusted to it, right? So, but at least the socialized system would enable us to not saddle them with tremendous debt burden should we fail them. And that to me is at least part of what could move us in the direction of being more honest about where students are and being able to communicate without the same kind of pressure on us. So in terms of the objective metrics, I'm traditionalist on this. I don't find it as hard as all the people that I read in the ungrading movement. To me, I create a rubric and I talk about, did you analyze the book accurately? Did you draw evidence from the author? Were you able to show that you read the book and could distill the core evidence? Do you have a lot of grammar errors, some grammar errors? So I create rubrics that ultimately translate into grades, and it just doesn't strike me as that difficult to do. What's difficult is the fact that I know, going back to Arthur's point, I know that if I grade too rigorously, or if I don't participate in this grade inflation game, that it's going to damage my own possible future in higher education. It could damage my program if we have a reduction in the number of majors. So no easy solutions. Last point on this, the only way to ever get to public financing, which sounds absurdly quixotic, would be through collective political trust in our society. And large numbers of conservative people already feel professors don't do anything. And never mind, I'm not going to grade either. I'm just going to give A's. And I understand Arthur and Vanessa's point. It's like, you're going to work harder. Okay, I'll accept that. You're working harder in the non-graded classes. It's not going to be translated that way in the wider public sphere, where we have to build political will if we're ever going to have a kind of socialized educational system. So I would leave it at that.
In all of our lifetimes, everyone on the panel, colleges, state universities were funded at far higher levels, like at 70, 80% by states. And so this, anywhere from 10 to 20% is new and, relatively new. So like 13% or something in some states. And so, yeah, it's much more of a business game, and they are much more customers than they are students now. And at least where I teach, that's made abundantly clear in not just by higher administrators, but even at the department level, that is abundantly clear.
So I wonder, is grade inflation tracking with monetary inflation?
Yeah.
I think grade inflation's beating it, but
yeah, that's a good question. Education costs are going up dramatically, as are grades.
I always I'm very interested in this, not just from background as an educator, but as a behavioral scientist, as a social worker, and a lot of the underlying reasons given for things like ungrading or alternative grading. And a lot of it seems to be related to the emotional well-being of a student. So how a student actually takes not being so great at something that they hoped they were great at. And I wonder if what you think about the idea or thought or possibility that this movement is being pushed in place of another type of intervention that students may need, whether it's a therapeutic intervention or a motivational one. It could be possible that those students didn't turn in those assignments because they simply weren't motivated to do it, because maybe they're not a motivated student and maybe they shouldn't be in the type of program that they're in. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on
I mean, I think with K-12, there's part of it that is going to always be a little bit different than higher ed, in that we take whoever comes to us and we teach them. And so I think that in terms of letting students know that they're not cut out for this or that is not really on our priority list at all. You know, it's mostly about supporting them to learn and to grow and to make as big a strides as they possibly can. Yes, there are situations at the K-12 level where you don't get a part in the play or whatever else. You know, maybe you don't even make it into a certain class. But I don't think that ends up being part of our calculus in terms of. Yeah.
It sounds a little backwards.
How so?
But because I mean, it would seem that the K-12 school system is the one that takes everybody.
Yeah.
And higher education should has a little bit more rigor or standardization for who gets accepted.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I thought I heard you.
I mean, I think I heard a little bit in your question just in terms of how do you communicate to a student that, you know, they don't quite pass muster when it comes to this particular area or skill. And I don't think that's something that we often think about in K-12 education.
Yeah. Well, I think, though, you've been talking, I guess I'm going to challenge you, because I think you've talked about that. I think part of you've described your feedback as teaching them how to accept feedback, how to take that feedback and do something with it. And, you know, I mean, learning how to do that and, you know, remain civil, you know, and work within that system is very important. So if you never give feedback, then they, of course, you know, we can't learn that. And so, so I actually think that you have been talking about that, but, and in a good way. I mean, that you've been saying that's, you know, that's what you do. So, you know, I do wonder, though, whether we are so comfortable in our lives now that we're hyper focused on the discomfort. To get back to Brandy's question, like, are we focusing so much on student discomfort? You know, self-esteem has never been higher, and yet they're more depressed and more anxious also. So what's, you know, are we so hyper focused on struggles and discomfort and everything because, frankly, we're living pretty good lives? You know, I don't know if this is part. I guess I would agree that it does feel like it is part of that the ungrading is, you know, sort of the added benefit is that it's maybe going to hurt their feelings a little bit less. I don't know.
So I would say that, to your point about, you know, students who are struggling or going through some things, with K-12, we're trying to build in other supports that aren't tied to their learning or their grades. So it could be social emotional regulation. It could be circle time. It could be all these other things that we're trying to teach students, but not necessarily tied to their grade or not trying to hurt their feelings. Really, in a lot of the ungrading classes, the students are coming, they're looking at the standard that we're trying to set, which is a pretty high standard. And they themselves are starting to come to the conclusions like, ooh, maybe my work isn't up to par. It's not just the adult telling them you're not good enough. The student is starting to analyze their own work. They're starting to peer assess. They're starting to do other things in which they realize that their work is not up to par. And then coming up with a plan to say, well, what are we going to do to move? And the teacher is the one who is supporting that work and facilitating that work so that students can get where they need to go. So it's not about sparing their feelings. It's about saying, hey, how can you be a part of this work and say that this really isn't where we need to be? How are we going to get there?
I think in looking at this in K-12, one of the things that that I've noticed is there's been a little bit of maybe attack is too strong of a word, but focus on eliminating things like gifted education, honors, AP, for the sake of kind of moving towards removing academic rigor, a little bit of scholarship from education. Do you see in any way, shape, or form those movements being connected?
What were the two movements again? I'm sorry.
So looking at the movement for alternative grading or ungrading, and the movement towards eliminating AP and honors courses.
I'll chime in if no one wishes to. Arthur, you about to say?
No, go ahead.
No, I definitely think they're related. Again, I'm going to draw from my research in political psychology. I think equity concerns and deep compassion are probably at the very heart of this entire movement. And we're looking at disparities in individual performance, and group performance disparities are the most painful. We look at those things, and I think it's a more or less, perhaps unconscious effort to essentially try to equal the playing field, equal these outcomes. So it definitely entails the therapeutic dimension. I don't say that disparagingly. Obviously we should be compassionate toward our students. It entails that, being sensitive to the mental health and other challenges that they have. But at the end of the day, when we see these disparities, it's very painful to us, and it makes us sort of gravitate to efforts to try to teach in a way that doesn't drive home these inequalities, maybe from the standpoint of a kind of egalitarian view. And actually, this question I would ask Vanessa and Arthur too. I'm sorry, Brandy, you asked a different one, but I would be curious to know, Vanessa and Arthur, would you subscribe to this view? Like, most students, most of the time, where they end up in life is due to their background. So the reason people end up not being able to succeed is because they're poor and they had disadvantages. And it's not really ultimately a reflection of their ability and effort. And the only reason why people rise up in our system is because they have family connections and resources and legacies and things like that. Do you think that characterizes most of our society's positions, or do you believe that merit also is a factor in the way in which actual people rise up? I know, Arthur, you mentioned presidents that obviously don't have that background. Would you generalize that and say the vast majority of our positions in society are illegitimate and are a function simply of class power, not a function of people's ability?
No, I wouldn't make a blanket statement about that at all, but I'm just saying that it's definitely questionable how effective the quote unquote merit-based system has been. I think about, I got my start in education working in alternative education, and I worked with students who in many cases came to us at third or fifth grade level, if we're to believe the diagnostic test that we would administer to them when they arrived. And so we're in a pretty terrible situation right from the beginning, and they're woefully behind on credits. And again, you say at the end of the day, does it ultimately become a matter of, we have to make a determination? Yes, possibly at the end of the day. I think higher ed is a little bit more at the end of the day. We are still in the middle of the day and trying to change those destinies. And so what I found with those students who were coming to me, when I gave them an F, when I gave them a D, that oftentimes it wasn't a reflection of their competence or their ability to develop competence. It was more a reflection, as you say, Mark, of their background or what it was they were currently going through, whether that was food insecurity or housing insecurity, or our school provided daycare. They were having a baby. And so there were a number of factors that were involved. This was at a time when we were really relying on metrics as whether or not we are going to reward this or that educational approach or educational institution. And we were, this is in Michigan in the early 2000s, we were not able to make that case. There was our dashboard, if you remember the dashboards of the early 2000s, to determine whether or not you're going to move to a certain neighborhood or not because of the schools. Our dashboard never reflected the fact that we were taking students through 2, 3, 4 years worth of learning because their achievement status didn't reflect that. So it was so painfully ironic that actually on the Michigan website, there were 2 things that were going to factor into our overall score. One was achievement status, which was based on the state exam. The other one was achievement growth. Achievement growth never went online. They could never figure out how to quantify it, and our school closed down. We tried to bring in our congressman to describe what a difference we make in these children's lives. We tried to talk about how their destinies were changed by going to community college, and in many cases going on to higher education than that. But ultimately, it was those numbers that mattered. And that's why I believe, and even now in a school that uses grades, one, they don't have anywhere near as much signal as they used to. But if we think that those numbers are going to tell our story, we're kidding ourselves. We need to get in the habit of telling our story, or else we're not going to survive. And I think that's a very hard message that we also need to share with our students, that yes, I am the expert. I need to certify your competence, and that's my responsibility. But it's your responsibility to tell us the story of your learning and growth. And yes, much of it's going to happen along this single trajectory that everyone else is on. But you also need to tell us about those different ways that you're learning. And that's just a whole universe of possibility that I think that we need to train students about, that they can't fall into this passivity. We've lulled them into this passivity because of our monopoly on assessment. It's totally monologic. And to invite them into that dialogue. And yes, of course, we're holding the standards of our discipline. We're holding them to that standard, but we also need to invite them to the table at that, and to invite them to start talking about their learning, to assess their learning, to assess the learning of others, and to communicate that out.
I want to ask one question that often doesn't come into these conversations. It's a minority demographic of students that often gets ignored in conversations about grading or ungrading or alternative grading. How does this impact the gifted student? So the academically gifted student, whether they come from a disadvantaged socioeconomic background or an advantaged one, how does switching or changing up the grading, the assessment, how does that impact that minority demographic of students? Has there been any research on that? Is anyone interested in that? Is that any part of the conversation? And one of the reasons I bring this up is personal. I was that super poor kid that was super academically gifted, able to be part of the gifted program in school. And so when I see things like those opportunities being taken away, a lot of the conversation is focused on, well, advantaged kids will still hold their advantage. And there really isn't any consideration for the kid that grew up really poor, dependent on publicly funded public schools and academically gifted programs.
Yeah, I mean, it's wrong to harm people who don't deserve to be harmed, but it is also wrong to harm people who do deserve some kind of distinction. Removing these gifted programs, who are we harming? So we may be harming some people who through merit, like yourself, have would have access to programs that have existed historically. So those students may not get what they merit. They don't get what they merit. So I agree. It's we are very focused on what people might bringing people up to standard. And Arthur, you mentioned, we're just sort of like in the middle, and it's higher ed. They're the ones that are, we have to, Mark and I, we have to do much more of the sorting. Well, here's the thing. Mark and I are in a situation where we're hearing things like what I heard in the hallway. Oh, well, there's a teacher test for that. So at each level, students are getting pushed along. So in elementary school, they're getting told, wait till you get to middle school. Then in middle school, well, wait till you get to high school, things are going to change. Wait till you get to college, things are going to change. We've been saying in this Zoom room, wait till you get to to the workplace, then things are going to change. I don't know if things are changing. I really do. I don't know that people who are working in as Arthur said, these sort of like low level college educated but low level, maybe create jobs that require creativity. I don't know if they're getting sorted or not, or if they're just simply getting marginalized, and because they haven't had good feedback and learned how to take that feedback. Are they not even aware that they're being marginalized, that they're not getting promoted, that they're not getting new, fun, creative work, because they don't know how to read the signals? I just don't. I wish I knew some of the answers to that.
If I could.
Oh, go ahead, Mark. Well, actually, because this addresses someone's question in the audience. And before we get to the end of the discussion, I want to make sure that we address some of those. But I also want to interrupt my own self to say there's so much here that what I'd love to do is do some follow-up podcasts with each of you so that we can, even flesh this out a little bit more and more in depth. But we've got Manny Delgado, who says something really interesting, Elizabeth. I think it touches on what you were saying, is they believe that when we did away with vocational training, that actually, that was something that really, I guess, pushed some of the grade inflation. But how important vocational training was, it was disastrous to not have it and to devalue that as, or consider it not worthy of part of the educational system. So I thought that was a very interesting idea and very interesting comment that might play into some of this idea of grade inflation.
Yeah, and I think, now we're all paying the price for that, right? Try to get somebody to come to your house and fix your plumbing, right?
Well, this goes into a much bigger issue that is not, but there's a book called Tribe, and it's like we value certain things, like we value people in the economy, we value, Wall Street people, but we don't value the plumber or the electrician whose work is as valuable, and in part, education might be to blame for some of that, particularly now that we've taken vocational education out as a serious path for students.
Yeah, and I don't think many. Mark, maybe it's different at Seton Hall than it is where I am, but I think most of my students don't actually know why they're there, and they've chosen their major sort of maybe by default. Maybe they just declared it when they got there and they just sort of kept on going. And so, yeah, I think that they haven't given the kind of thought that I think many parents hoped that they would. And I think many parents, at least where I teach, a lot of first generation college students, don't really know why they're sending their students to college either, except it's just like, well, that's what you're supposed to do. That's how you're going to make it. And then, like Mark said, they get in debt and this cycle, and with grade inflation and with No Child Left Behind, we've created this system where yes, high school diplomas, people with high school diplomas made more money when No Child Left Behind hit the books. It's like, oh, we have this correlation, and what happened was they communicated correlation as if it were causation. So if we get more people to graduate from high school, more people will make more money. And of course, that didn't happen. What happened was high school diploma became worth nothing, right? It was not meritocracy. Anyway, it did not signal merit. I can't say the word. It did not signal merit. So now it's like, oh, now you got to get more education. And that education isn't free. And so that we have created this system by making sure that no one fails high school. Who those people used to go on and still make a living, right? But now you can't get a job at anywhere without a high school diploma, and it doesn't mean anything anymore. So it's a cycle that's feeding on itself. Now you got to go get a graduate degree.
If I could just chime in with a couple closing points. One, lest there be any doubt about this, like my support of testing and grading could not be more further removed from my utter rejection of high stakes testing and tying teachers and schools to the learning outcomes of their students. That's another podcast about why that's such a bad idea. And then secondly, the merit issue, it's not just, although it is important that the student, the gifted student gets affected personally, that's a big deal, but our society gets hurt. You got these California schools, so then you're going to have more students of all these different abilities, mixed together, in my experience, that creates an inertial effect to go to the least prepared student, which means that these students that are more prepared or gifted aren't going to be cultivating. Just because you're gifted in modern society doesn't mean you just become an engineer or doctor the next day. You have to dedicate your energy. And if we're not giving the resources and time, and we're commandeering all of our resources to the least prepared students, it's going to have long-term consequences in a world of pretty significant economic and ecological challenges.
Arthur and Vanessa, I know that's probably your button saying, "Hey, time is up." That's okay. That's okay because time is up. And again, I'm going to reach out to each of you. Yes, that's the outro music. I am planning on reaching out to each of you because I want to carry on the conversation. But Arthur, Vanessa, any final words from you?
Just thank you for the opportunity. This has been really great. I mean, being a public school middle grades educator, to kind of hear from the secondary perspective has been enlightening, or the higher ed perspective has been enlightening. And yeah, I have a lot to chew on and reflect. So thank you guys for your input. It's been great.
Thank you.
So we'll pull this together again in one form or fashion. Thank you all, everyone. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot myself.